Good morning, church. Grace and peace be with you. We're so glad that you're here on this morning or daytime or whenever you've decided to check out this YouTube sermon conversation. We're glad that you could be a part of it. A few announcements as we get started. First of all, a reminder that we share communion together every first Sunday during what is typically our holding space time that we're calling it now. We encourage you to bring your own bread and your own juice and join us for that time. We will lead you through the communion liturgy. Also on Passion Sunday, which is March 28th, we have scheduled some time from 2 to 4 p.m. to come be here at the church and to clean up around the church building. We haven't been meeting here regularly, but there have been folks who've been meeting here regularly outside of our space and leaving behind quite a bit of trash and things like that. So if we could be here, and we could do some planting as well. And if you would like to bring flats of flowers and of course, wear your masks, and we'll be safe, but we'll be outside as well, and we'll beautify the exterior of our church space. Then, as we continue Holy Week on Good Friday at 6 o'clock p.m., we will have an online communion liturgy where we do what we typically do, which is to combine Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and commemorate the Last Supper, the last time that Jesus was with his disciples before his crucifixion, and then, of course, the Passion itself on Good Friday. So 6 p.m., once again, bring your own elements, and we will join together for a meaningful time of communing together and remembering the death of Jesus. And then on Easter Sunday, on April 4th, we will have a live online Easter Sunday service. It'll be at 10 a.m., and we will have some time to remember our baptism. So we invite you to bring a small vessel of water. There will be a liturgy where we will touch the water. Typically, we do baptisms on Easter Sunday morning, but since we're not meeting in person this year, this is how we will remember our baptism. And then from 2 to 4 in the afternoon, my family, the Goebel family, will be here at the church building. There's an opportunity for you to stop by or drive by, whatever you feel safe doing. If you want to bump elbows, or if you're vaccinated, I'm vaccinated, Amy's vaccinated, want to give a hug, you can do that, and to have some time to say goodbye and to tell each other how much we love each other and appreciate one another. So that will be from 2 to 4 p.m. on Easter Sunday, which is April 4th. All of this information is already up on our Facebook pages, and it'll be in the newsletter coming up. So make sure to pay attention to those communication sources for any information that you need. Jules, what opportunities do we have to continue to give and serve as a community?
Our Wednesday lunch program continues, and you'll note that the outdoor pantry has grown, and we continue to need donations not only for the lunch ministry and the deliveries to our neighbors that are coordinated by Laura Perky and that team, but also continual provision of food and supplies to the outdoor pantry as we continue to have folks stop by and clear the space. It is hard to keep that stacked because the need is so heavy. So please feel free to drop non-perishable items or items that will, be able to last a few days outside off in that pantry space. And thank you all for your incredible generosity, not only over the last year, but specifically over the last few months as we've continued to serve our community and our neighbors. You'll have the opportunity, if you haven't already, to be able to come to consensus as a congregation. You'll have received in your email an opportunity to take a survey. One question: where does our quarterly missional giving go locally this quarter? Please feel free to participate in that. There were 3 options given, and we will, as we always do every year, give locally in that way. Some of you will also want to note that the Community of Hope Gala will be happening again early summer, likely in June, and our church participates heavily in that. So if you are able to support our neighbors at the transitional housing program at Community of Hope by either volunteering or participating in an auction, donating cash, all of those things in the next few months, please pay attention to our neighbors over at COH, because we will want to participate in that as much as possible. And more news will come about that over the next few months. Thank you so much for all that you're doing, all the places you're giving, including Portsmouth Union Church. Please continue to be generous as our communities continue to need your generosity. And if you need to give by automated giving and you're not sure how to do that, please reach out to the finance team, to Brenda Van Reen in particular, and we can make sure that you have access to those resources to make it as easy as possible. All right, let me pray for us, and then we're going to get into Psalm 51 today and talk about confession. Let me pray. God, we do give thanks for all of the blessings that you have brought into our lives, the opportunities to serve your people and you, to embody your spirit in this world, to show up and be living examples of the stories of Jesus with our neighbors. We pray that you will show us the way where we have fallen short, that you will right us again, help us get off our knees and onto our feet and try again. We ask that where we need forgiveness, where we need help, where we have not had our eyes opened to the places where we are being called to be good disciples for you, that you would help us open our eyes, open our hands, and open our hearts. And so we ask all of this in your name and in all the holy names of God. Amen.
All right, our text for today is from Psalm 51, verses 1 through 12. And there we read, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence, and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in the inward being, therefore teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain in me a willing spirit." Hear what the Spirit is saying through the scriptures.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. So, Jules, as we talked about before we started recording, this is one of 7 penitential psalms that we find. This particular psalm, the context for this psalm is David has just been confronted by Nathan. King David's been confronted by Nathan about the situation that he created with Bathsheba, namely that he saw Bathsheba on the roof and decided that he wanted her as his own. And so he set up to have her husband Uriah killed in battle, and then took her as his wife, is the way it would say in the Bible, but we know there was much more of a violation than that, and then continued to be in denial about it. And so finally Nathan confronts him and says, "Dude, you really screwed up here. Like, we need to deal with this." And David realizes that he's been running from what he's done, from this terrible sin, and writes, composes this particular psalm in response, a deep cry of confession to God, a recognition of just how terrible what he did was. And so we get this psalm, this classic psalm of confession that's really, really familiar. You had mentioned that you actually memorized this psalm during Lent a few years ago, and that you still know this psalm. I wonder about that experience of memorizing that, and I imagine you still know it. And I wonder what this psalm does for you, what it says to you, why meaningful enough to memorize it.
Yeah, it was about 20 years ago now. It seems impossible, but that's true. And I do still have it in my heart. What's meaningful about it for me is this wrestling that I have done. I don't come from a background where bad behavior would send me to hell, right?
Mm.
Like that's not my motivation around being good. And I know it's not for many people, and we've gone new places with that theology. Uh, but this sense of like, it's really hard for me to apologize.
Mm.
It's really hard for me to say, I directly, I screwed up. I can do it internally. I'm very good at judging myself internally. But to come to someone else and say, I really made a big mistake or a series of mistakes, because there's this also this sense in me of like, I will compound my own mistake over and over and over again,
Right.
trying to fix it or trying to cover it over. And I think David does this throughout his story, right? Like
Oh yeah.
all the things that happen post Bathsheba are like, whoo, he just makes the problem worse and worse and worse and worse. And so for me, having it memorized helps me to be reminded of language that isn't natural to me and gives me some words to lean on that are not um about I'm garbage, I'm just bad, but are about I need help.
Mm.
I need and David does it so well. I need God's help to do differently the next time, and to really look at myself honestly so that I can go to someone, a human person, and say what he said. It's like it's almost like practice.
Yeah.
If I can get clear with God in that way, like David does, then it makes it easier for me to practice it on the ground with human beings. And so I felt like that was really important for me in that season of life. And it's been a useful tool. I would
Mhm.
encourage that as a spiritual practice for anybody coming through Lent or any time of year.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something to um well, I mentioned this to you, that one of my seminary professors said that he wishes that confession were a sacrament in the Protestant church as it
Mhm.
is in the Catholic church, because there is something powerful about confession in maintaining healthy relationship between individuals, and healthy relationship with God, right? I used to read this, and because I did grow up in a tradition where I was afraid of going to hell, and I used to read this, and I didn't like reading this psalm, because it was like, oh no, this is me, and if I'm afraid, if I tell God all of my sins, that God's just going to get really mad and send me to hell, which is not only terrible theology, but just not very logical, right?
Right. God
Um,
knows, regardless of whether you say it out loud.
exactly, but it was like, if I don't say it, then maybe God, who was a he to me back then, well, won't
Won't punish me.
notice, won't
Yeah.
punish me, right? But uh, I was way off in that, and as I mentioned, also previously, having children helped me to appreciate this psalm. Having my theology changed, and my understanding of the the um, the depth of God's love and grace and forgiveness that absolutely helps me to appreciate the psalm, but also having having kids, you
Hmm.
know, and teaching my own children to own your actions, to be able to, and I remember saying to them, you know, you're so much better off if you confess, if you tell me what you did, if you don't try to lie about it or cover it up. uh, you're going to be so much better off if you do that, if you lie about it, especially if I know you did something. It's just going to break down trust. That relationship is going to be, it's going to be damaged, and I'm not going to be able to trust you as much. uh, Whereas if you tell me the truth and say you're sorry and own your actions, then I have the opportunity to forgive, and we can work on it, and it just maintains that relationship. It maintains confession, creates this, clears the channel for maintaining healthy relationships, and that's with humanity. But I also think with God, the opportunity um, to receive that forgiveness again, right? But by offering confession, I I happen to love the idea of being, and sometimes we do it in the course of our liturgy on Sunday mornings. There will be a time of a prayer of confession, and then a reminder by the liturgist that indeed there's absolution, there is forgiveness, the love and grace of God does block these things out, and you have opportunity to always to start over again.
And that nobody is exempt from that. You know, we say confession is good for the soul. That could be this whole sermon in a sentence.
Mhm.
That in that liturgy, what I always love about it as somebody who usually reads it and is the liturgist, is that we confess together as a whole community things we've done and things we've left undone. And then I would say, or you would say as the liturgist, you are forgiven, and to say it out loud. And it's so clear, you are forgiven. And in response, the community says, and you are forgiven. So that
Yeah.
no one is left out of this knowing of, we are all very clear on what has gone wrong. And we are all very clear that we are still beloved of God. And that's, I think, is so important, because there's no one of us that is exempt from needing to hear that or to do that.
Hmm. And in doing that, in having that be a part of uh, the worship service, allows us to then take that modeling and uh, take it into the world,
The
and
world.
to do that in relationship. It's one of the things that one of the ways that I knew that we could do ministry together is because very early on we established uh, this as a part of our communication, as a part of our relationship, right from the beginning. I think the first time I was ever upset with you about something, I shared that with you,
Yeah.
and you immediately said, I'm sorry, you're right. I I did that, and I feel terrible, and I hope you'll forgive me. And in that moment, this was like really early on. We hadn't even become a union church. We were just trying to figure out how to do ministry together. But I
Yeah.
knew in that moment, I was like, okay, I can work with this person because there's opportunity for I can share, and this person will say they're so. You didn't get defensive. You didn't try to explain it away, because that would have been like, oh yeah, yeah. I told her I was hurt, and that was her reaction. Ugh, right? Um, I think that being able to, I don't just think this, I've experienced in just our work relationship that this allows for healthy relationship. It does, and I think it's true across the board in relationships. I know when in the other work that I do, when I've gone to my supervisors and said, hey, I messed up. I did this thing. It was a mistake. I'm sorry. How can I make it right? My supervisors have told me, and perhaps you've experienced this as well, Andy, that's why we appreciate you. Is you don't try to hide it, you don't try to cover it, you don't try to defend it. And I think that the need for that is so prevalent, and yet our tendency, because well, for all kinds of reasons, our tendency is to deny, to defend, to, not it, wasn't me, it was this person, or I did it because this person,
Yeah.
right? To blame shift.
Yeah.
That's our tendency.
And I think you're right. That is our tendency. And it's something that does not show up in this psalm at all. It's one of the
No.
things I love about this psalm is that David takes full responsibility for all of the things. And when we talked about the 10 commandments earlier in the year, and I think we talked about this story around coveting, and we walked back like how many commandments he broke just by starting with coveting.
Mhm.
And he admits to all of it. He says no excuses, no defensiveness, and how powerful it is to receive. I can only imagine. I really want God's perspective on this psalm and whether God would rewrite it in any way, because we're doing it as human beings, but maybe God has a different perspective. But this psalm isn't from God's perspective. This isn't God's judgment on David. This is David's judgment on David. And from that perspective, he goes whole heart into, oh my gosh, I am absolutely aware of how damaging and terrible, and to the point where he expresses a sense of like, this might be a permanent stain on my life because I did something. So help me
He
to not let this be permanent.
and he doesn't. The thing we need to remember, he's the king.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to. Like,
No.
he could say, like, nobody's going to argue with him if he's like, look what, well, did you see what she was wearing, or in this case wasn't wearing, right? Like, you could blame shift and be like, her fault. He could do that and nobody would argue, really, because he's the king.
Right.
But
he's aware, I
doesn't.
think. Yeah, he doesn't do that, but I think he's aware as this person who has come to a new understanding about himself, perhaps, that his actions put in danger the soul of the nation.
Yeah.
And not just his personal soul, but the
Mm.
soul of the people that he's responsible for. And wouldn't it be powerful if when we messed up, when I messed up, and this isn't about I'm so bad and terrible and and I'll never, like, it's not that. It's, wow, when I really harm people or harm myself, I am responsible for the reverberations through my community if I do not confess and fix it. That
Mm.
whatever follows beyond that harms the soul of my community. And for David to embody that in this psalm, I think is so helpful, especially since you and I have had lots of conversations about this really problematic piece of theology that I think defines enormous swaths of Christianity. And I will argue, and I think you will probably agree with me, that it is one of the worst pieces of theology that we have ever decided universally is true. And I will just say that it isn't true. And that is original sin,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, this idea, and this is where I do think David makes a mistake, because there's a little bit of original sin stuff in here for him, even though he has other evidence that is to the contrary, where he's like, oh, I was born a sinner. I was a sinner before my mother conceived me. And I start to get real uncomfortable because I'm like, wait a second. We have all of Genesis 1 telling us that that is not true. Our originating text is God making the world and saying, look how good it is. And then making the world and saying, look how good it is. And then making the world, which includes people, and saying, this is good. And over and over again, this is good. This is good. This is good. You are good. And all of the stories that we get, like, it, and I really want us to talk about, like, what does that theology of original blessing mean for confession? Like, how do we get from, oh, I'm so broken and permanently broken, to, wait a second, I was made good. And so
Right.
were the people around me. Like, what do we do with that? Because I think it's really harmful.
Yeah. Well, and it's harmful in that extending the doctrine of original sin leads us to eventually the need for uh, penal substitutionary atonement
Oh Lord,
theory,
now here you
right?
go. Right.
Right? Like this is where, because I am sin, I'm depraved from birth originally, and all of humankind is. Adam sinned, and so all of us are therefore depraved. That leads to this terrible doctrine, this terrible theology around crucifixion and around the death of Christ, where Jesus becomes a scapegoat for our sins. And God becomes then an abusive parent who lets God's son, be killed. None of which is helpful. And in my mind, none of which makes sense scripturally or theologically.
No.
But it leads to a terrible picture of God and a terrible picture of humanity that is, quite frankly, just really jacks things up. And it makes for some really unhealthy religion and
And some
unhealthy churches.
and dangerous churches.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Like if I will, you can push back on me with this, but like I think that there is a theology of original blessing that we get in Genesis 1. And then there is this moment where people use free will, do a thing, and make a mistake. They eat from the tree. And God says, "Oh, I told you not to do that. Why did you do that?" And instead of answering with, "We were curious," or "We wanted to, but didn't talk to you about it first," what's the first action that both Adam and Eve take? They immediately turn to the
Blame
other one
shift.
and say, "You made me do it. That one did it." And so, if there is a theology of original sin, if there is any of that present, it is a theology of original blame. Like when human beings are broken, when we do something wrong, if they had confessed, none of the stuff that follows, I am positing, would have happened. But they compounded the problem by blaming someone else. So if they had just said, "You're right, you told us not to, and we were wrong,"
We messed up.
everything about getting kicked out of Eden, all the stuff that happened next would not have happened. And instead, because they blamed one another and because they didn't take responsibility, there was a whole cascading effect of other things. So maybe our original sin is that we get defensive, we refuse to confess, and we decide to blame other people for our thing that we messed up.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. It makes me think about then I mean, that changes Christology. That changes a lot.
I just invented a new theology. Did you
I
like?
just I think it's beautiful, and I think that there's definitely some truth to that, because we see it all the time. We see, I mean, we've known people in our lives who are not willing to confess, who always blame other people for the
Yes.
things that they do. And we don't end up having much respect for those people. And I will say, quite frankly, oftentimes I don't want to be in relationship with those people.
That's right.
Because I don't feel like I can be heard, and I don't really want to say a whole lot. And I can't really trust that person.
You know
So
who I trust though, and I think this
Hmm.
is true for you too. People who make mistakes over and over again but are willing to admit it. I will put up with those people and be friends and family and in relationship with those folks as long as it takes.
Yep. Yep. No, absolutely. Because that is progress, I think, in relationship is,
Yeah.
and it just gives opportunity to try again. Just gives opportunity to try again, and to receive forgiveness again and again.
Right. which is our practice, right? We confess over and over again as Christian community because we know that we're messing up. We know we're finite. We know we make errors. We know that we hurt one another. But the work of forgiveness, the unique characteristic of Christianity is forgiveness.
Yeah.
And so, and it's so inherent in the person of God throughout Scripture, Hebrew Scriptures and Christian Scriptures, this idea of steadfast love. And David brings this into the Psalm over and over again, right? He says in verse 1, God's eternal promises of steadfast love are what are going to allow me to continue to have this conversation with you, oh God. And it's like this moment. I think about this psalm coming out of David's mouth or out of his pen, right? And where it just seems like he starts with that first verse and says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. And it's like he knows that what he is about to say requires him to take a really deep breath and remind himself of who he is and remind himself of the promises that God has made and remind himself of how he was made so that he can get the strength and the courage and the intestinal fortitude to do what is really hard next. And so I always like, okay, now I can say this. And I wonder if we challenged people last week, if they were to get into conversation with people around theology, if they would first say, may the meditations of my heart be pleasing and acceptable to you, O God. If before we got defensive or started to argue about who was right and who was wrong, if perhaps we said that first verse of Psalm 51 to ourselves, it might help us to say the next right thing and do better because we're reminded of who we are and how we were made before we get into some defensive self-posturing, right?
No, absolutely. I love that suggestion. I love that. And again, it's the beauty of this particular psalm, right alongside Psalm 19, is this need for self-reflection, the need to be to look internally and to realize that's what David's finally doing here. So much of his energy in trying to avoid being caught and trying to avoid confessing what he'd done wrong. It's as outward frenetic energy of no, it's all good, it's okay, nothing to see here, nope, I'm fine. And finally, and how much do we end up doing that? Spending our energy doing that when he finally turns in and looks inward and realizes, the opportunity then to have that time of confession and renewal and relief as well, because that's what comes. Confession is good for the soul because there's a sense of lightness afterwards, especially if it's received well. I want to acknowledge for a second that it is, I would say, a majority of the time, because I truly do believe that human beings are good. Ultimately, we are good. I believe that from Genesis. Most of the time, we receive confession and we at least acknowledge, and more often I think we are prone to want to forgive and be in right relationship again. I know that feeling of when I've confessed something to someone and said I've done you wrong and it's received well, and there can be, well, one time we could have hugs, right, and receive that. But I also want to acknowledge, because of a whole myriad of reasons, with all different kinds of human brokenness, because humans aren't perfect and we all have stories and our own traumatic experiences with not doing well with confession. Confession isn't always received well. And I want to acknowledge that for some people who might be listening and saying, and might want to say, hey, look, I did the confession thing and it didn't turn out well. And that person still doesn't talk to me.
Yep.
And I would say there's probably more to that. but at the same time, it's not like a one-to-one exact thing.
Yeah.
But more often, I do think that it is it's a way to stay in relationship and to stay connected.
And I'm so glad that you said that, because it reminds me that confession is about right relationship, but it's
Mhm.
not about fixing things necessarily,
Mhm.
right? So there are moments where people need to ask for forgiveness, and it is our right to not be obligated to forgive them if they haven't changed their behavior.
Mm.
Forgiveness isn't just about forgetting, it's about a change and an evolution in behavior. And so
Right.
it's, in some ways, confession is for the person confessing
Yeah.
more than it is for the person who's receiving the confession and has the right
Mm.
to say no thank you, or the right to say yes I forgive you. Those are two separate problems.
Yeah. That's a very
And
good point.
so David, I want so badly for this psalm, which is to God, to have a version that is to Bathsheba, and to have a version, as you have said to me, to Uriah, who's dead.
Yeah.
It would be a beautiful thing for us to be able to receive a trio of psalms of confession from David, because he has some other responsibilities here than to confess to God, right?
Yeah.
But this version, at least he gets to the point where he is honest with himself, he is trying to do something different, and he is pointing outwards and saying, I have done wrong, please help me to do better. So there's a lot of versions of, the point of confession is not to only erase what happened in the past.
Yeah, it's not a magic fix it.
Yeah.
It really isn't, but it is balm for the soul,
Yes.
at
Yeah.
least for well, it is for the person who's confessing.
Yeah.
I think that's a really beautiful point.
There's
Even if it isn't for the person who's receiving.
Right. Yeah, because sometimes you can't confess to the person that you hurt or harmed, and yet
Yeah.
you still have to confess somehow, which is why you and I receive confessions, even though it's not a sacrament in the Protestant church.
Mhm.
You and I both receive confessions from people in our community, because and clergy, priests have done that for millennia, because it's not only about saying it to the person you harmed, it's also saying it to yourself, and saying it out loud. I love this quote from St. Peter of Damascus. He's like this 12th century saint. He just sounds so postmodern when he's translated, but he says, should we fall, we should not despair, and so estrange ourselves from the Lord's love. We should not despair and so estrange ourselves from the Lord's love. Let us always be ready to make a new start. If you fall, rise up. If you fall again, rise up again. It's this process of, we're learning and we're going to do better next time. If you fall, rise up. If you fall again, rise up again. I love that encouragement from him, because I think we all need it. There's no single
I do
confession
too.
that will cover it all, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave the conversation and move toward questions. What questions do we have for folks to consider after this conversation about confession?
Yeah. We have 3 questions. And I really encourage people to think about this. I'll be thinking about these for myself. Can you think of a specific time when all you could do was rely on God's steadfast love so that you could begin again? Maybe you couldn't confess to the person that you harmed. Maybe you were just so deep in the shame spiral that there was no way to get out, right? Yeah. Can you think of a time when you had to rely on that steadfast love in order to start again? Second one is, can you think of a time when someone confessed to you that they'd done you wrong, much like Andy's examples that he shared with us? And how did that confession change your relationship? Did it have an impact on how you dealt with each other later? And then finally, and this is an important Lenten practice for all of us, is there something that you personally need to confess to God or to someone else in order to complete a faithful and holy Lent this year? What confessions need to get born into the world so that you can complete Lent and come into Easter with a contrite heart? as the psalmist says.
Yeah.
So those are our questions.
Awesome. We're going to take a moment and share as our closing prayer before the benediction this Howard Thurman prayer from the Work of the People. And so we'll let you take a few moments to see this, and then we'll come back and sing our way out.
Lord, Lord, open unto me. Open unto me light for my darkness. Open unto me courage for my fear. Open unto me hope for my despair. Open unto me peace for my turmoil. Open unto me joy for my sorrow. Open unto me strength for my weakness. Open unto me wisdom for my confusion. Open unto me forgiveness for my sins. Open unto me tenderness for my toughness. Open unto me love for my hates. Open unto me thyself for myself. Lord, Lord, open unto me.
I want to invite you to join in our traditional closing benediction song to sing to and with one another. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make God's face to shine upon you and be gracious, gracious, gracious to you. The Lord lift up God's countenance upon you and give you, give you, give you peace. Continue to be at peace. Love you and miss you.
Go in peace.